It feels weird that I have two games in a row where the fate of a Western game studio was heavily tied to the TurboGrafx-16. The only two companies I could really say this about are Cinemaware and Working Designs. But before I get to that US publisher, let's start with Human Entertainment's original release in Japan. Vasteel is a wargame with a plot. The gist of it is that in a science fiction future, the Emperor has died, leaving two sons. The Emperor died at a moment of political chaos, and the son that takes the throne continues his father's policies which weren't able to address the situation. A transparently villainous rich guy approaches the other son and encourages him to start a rebellion on behalf of the people of the Empire. From that, you pick a side and play out the war between the brothers. Now, even though certain other Japanese publishers had started to skimp on their voice cast for their PC Engine games, this was Human's first CD-ROM game. They weren't going to do that. So one of the two brothers was played by Shuichi Ikeda, whose best-known role is quite possibly the most popular character in Gundam, Char Aznable. And the other brother was played by Kazuhiko Inoue, who's played popular characters in quite literally everything, but his defining role would have been as the hero Joe in Cyborg 009. With a powerhouse voice cast like that lined up on the Japanese side, what would they do with the American version? Well, let's give it a listen.
The Emperor. I must protect my inherited kingdom, regardless of the cost. Perhaps if I contact Stefan, I can understand his position and end this war before it begins.
Yeah, they just used whoever was in the office. And what an office that was. Okay, take a seat. It's time for us to have the talk. It's time that we talk about Working Designs. If you're not familiar with the company, Working Designs held a unique place among video game nerds of the 90s. They formed as a small, independent publisher that would localize Japanese games for the American market that other companies would consider marginal. Things that were both time-consuming enough and didn't have enough of an audience to justify a release. In attitude, style, and form, Working Designs were very similar to other people bringing over Japanese media in the early 90s. They were limited both by availability and finances in what they could license, and so it gives a lot of their publication history the feeling of the scraps. But it also meant that they wound up getting games that developed a cult following. The game that Working Designs is probably best known for publishing is the Lunar series of RPGs. So that's the good. The bad is what I've already mentioned. Working Designs was really a product of their time, and they had an attitude toward localization of Japanese media that was common at that point. Translations that would be best described as loose, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when you're loose and also poorly written, Working Designs also had a bad tendency to try to improve the games that they published, and those improvements were inevitably poorly conceived and made the games significantly worse. Their changes are so disliked that there is an entire genre of fan patches for games specifically to undo what Working Designs changed. So were they good? Were they bad? I honestly can't say. A bit of both, really. I'm glad that they got stuff to store shelves that just wouldn't be released in the US otherwise, but I'm also often disappointed in the final result from their releases. In conclusion, Working Designs is a land of contrasts. Vasteel was their final release for the TurboGrafx system. It was just coincidentally the first one published in Japan. Although now that I've reached Working Designs, we're going to be seeing a lot of them in the next couple months. Well, let's get back to Vasteel as the game in question. And the very first thing that people are going to ask is, what did Working Designs change with their version? And as far as I can tell, very little. I couldn't really feel a difference between how the Japanese version played and the US version played. In the 15-minute long opening cutscene that I watched, yes, this game's opening is weirdly long, I found the translation to be stiff, but nothing that made me go, oh, why did they do that? I have seen people online blame working designs for the weird, out-of-place, smooth jazz soundtrack, but that was there in the original Japanese version. Human Entertainment must have really liked elevator music. There are 2 different ways to fight in Vasteel. There's Versus Mode, where you can pick any map in the game and just go at it. You can play against the computer or another person using that mode. Then there's Story Mode, which gives you a series of scenarios, and the story has small branches depending on if you win or lose. This is a turn-based, hex-based wargame. Each of your units is just one giant robot, and only one of them can occupy a hex at a time. On your turn, you get income based on the number of factories that you control, and then you can purchase additional units at your home base. Every unit is rated on their health, a primary weapon, a secondary weapon, and how quickly they can move. Some units also are better in certain terrain than others. So marine and aerial units will have no trouble going through the ocean, but your ground units might only be able to move a hex or 2 once they hit it. There are transport units in the game, and you board those by moving your mech onto them. And then on the transport units move, you can choose to unload. Everybody can take a move action, and combat begins when either 2 units come together, or you move one of your units onto a facility that the enemy controls. Combat plays out in this overhead action view, and while you have giant sprites, those giant sprites are also a pain to control. Movement winds up feeling a bit unresponsive, and you're going to have a real challenge dodging incoming shots. You hit button 2 to fire your primary gun, and button 1 to fire your secondary gun, and both of those have limited ammunition. If you're fighting another mech or a transport ship, then you fight until someone dies. If you're attacking a facility, then you'll appear on a map with a bunch of defensive turrets, and you have to locate and destroy the facility's core. There's an arrow that'll help guide you to it, but the maps are pretty big. Combat really just comes down to putting yourself into position and shooting faster than the other guy. Maneuvering and dodging just isn't effective here. You shoot in the direction that you move. So if you dodge, you're not hitting the enemy, and they're just taking more shots at you. Damage carries over after combat, so if you're facing a tough unit, you can wear them down by throwing bodies at them. The way that you recover is taking that unit back to a friendly repair facility. And this is how it goes, taking turns back and forth until somebody's main base has been captured. Of course, once the snowball starts moving for a player, it's almost definitely going to keep going. There's no strategies that you can apply, no clever maneuvers. You can't form defensive lines or flank people or support attacks. You just throw bodies at each other. Vasteel did get a sequel release on the PC Engine, but that one wasn't released in the US. We'll see it once I reach 1994. Japanese players don't have a whole lot to say about Vasteel. Mostly it's confusion over the soundtrack choice, some appreciation for the story, and not actually liking how the game plays. Vasteel wasn't the only game at this point to try to combine a strategic map with action encounters, and those other games also struggled with making the action interesting. For me, what it comes down to is that the strategic portions of Vasteel don't offer any strategy, and the action portions don't offer any action. It's 2 not very good halves making a not so good whole. Even at this point, the PC Engine had a lot better options for wargames. The only real strength that Vasteel has going for it is the story mode.